Hello and welcome to Real Cheating Story. Judith thought to herself. There was no possible way things could be any better than they were. She told herself again that she was blessed, she had it all. She paused in her activities to look at herself in the full-length mirror mounted to the back of the door to her closet. She saw a tall woman with blonde hair just touching her shoulders, eyes somewhere between light green and gray, and a body in great condition. She touched her hair, smoothing back a few wayward wisps, and smiled. Yes, she was still quite good-looking for a woman in her 40s. Judith Proctor turned back to her packing. She took her little black dress, 3 pairs of casual slacks, and 5 blouses. She folded them neatly, using some old towels to minimize wrinkles, and put them into her suitcase. She had already packed her underwear and a new nightgown. All she had left were a few pairs of shoes in her cosmetic case, and she was ready. She didn't anticipate needing much, so she would be finished well before Rick and the boys were due back. 3 days and 3 nights in San Diego, all paid for. The launch of the Dalton Power Drill SLS screwdriver combination aimed at the women's market was finished, and it had been a complete success. Dalton Industries was sending her and her project co-chairman on an all-expenses-paid trip to the Redstone Resort in San Diego as a bonus for meeting and exceeding all project goals. It was business, of course. There would be 2 days of self-congratulations and motivational speeches, and the last day exhorting them all to do it again. But overall, there should be a lot of free time. All she had to pay for was some shopping and souvenirs for Rick and the boys. She wanted to get something extra nice for Rick for being so understanding about this trip. She had been a little afraid to mention it to him when the opportunity presented itself at work. Judith was one of the top designers for Casual Creations, a company that took consignments from other companies that wanted to market a particular product. Casual Creations designed the product styling within the design framework, created the packaging, and scheduled the advertising. They could take a product from inception all the way through launch, with each department doing its part in the overall scheme. Judith was a packaging specialist, her forte being the graphics and pictorial presentation. She was very good at it and well paid for this product. In addition to her usual work, she had also offered a contemporary design that the company loved. This project was especially interesting to her, and she had spent many long hours perfecting it. When she proposed it to Rick, he was pleased that the company would do this for her but wasn't thrilled about her being gone for that long. After all, he pointed out, she had spent many evenings away from home working on the same project that now wanted to send her away again for 3 days. She had patiently worked on his sense of fairness to convince him that she had earned this by working hard and wanted to do this. Eventually, he gave in, though not without some reluctance. As she thought about it, she was surprised at how easily he had given in. She had expected days of complaining and whining, but he only protested for a couple of hours before conceding. She closed her suitcase, checked the locks to be sure they were set, and pocketed the key. She picked up the bag and went downstairs to check on dinner. She had fixed a pot roast with baby potatoes and carrots and had baked a coconut cream pie that she bought frozen, as she was never very good at pastries. She wanted to set a nice table tonight before she had to leave for the airport. Rick had said they could eat at 5:30 rather than their normal 6:15 to give her time to spend with them before they left. She saw that everything was right on schedule. She remembered the night before when she and Rick had shared a particularly passionate moment. Rick had been unusually intense, which had made the experience quite memorable. The thought of being away for 3 nights made her want to make this night special for him. Since his vasectomy, they no longer needed protection, and they had enjoyed each other thoroughly. It had been very satisfying for both of them. Rick had always been an exceptional partner, and he had never disappointed her. Even after the birth of their 2 boys, their intimacy had remained strong, though there had been a brief period of adjustment during the early stages of this project. However, things had improved, and she preferred not to dwell on that time. Rick was her husband, and together they had built a wonderful home for each other and their 2 boys, Will and Robert. Will, the older, was almost 9 years old now, while Robert, at 7, often acted more mature than his brother. Will was the carefree one, and Robert was more serious. They complemented each other well, and she loved them both equally. Rick and Judith had met 15 years ago at a party hosted by a mutual friend. They had hit it off immediately. At that time, Rick was 25 and Judith was 23. Although they both graduated from Rutgers University, they hadn't crossed paths while on campus. They dated for nearly 2 years, both committed to their careers, and eventually moved in together and married. Judith remembered the night Rick proposed as one of her favorite memories. Their life together had been wonderful, and when they felt ready for children, they were blessed with 2 healthy boys. She truly felt she had it all. She felt a slight chill at that thought but attributed it to nerves about the trip. She was waiting when the kids came through the door and gathered them for hugs and kisses, which they pretended embarrassed them. Rick was right behind, and together they ushered the boys upstairs to wash for dinner. Once they were gone, Judith wrapped her arms around Rick to give him a heartfelt kiss and hug. She noticed a tenseness about him, but before she could say anything, he relaxed, returned the hug and the kiss, and then gently pushed her back. "What's this, miss us already?" "You haven't even left yet," he teased with a smile, though she saw a shadow in his eyes that the smile didn't fully brighten. "Just glad to see my 3 men. I want to spend this time with you before I have to leave for the airport," she said, clinging to him. "You don't have to go, you know." "We all want you to stay," she said, pushing his head back gently. Rick looked into her eyes, waiting for a response. He knew what her answer would be, but he asked, "It's too late now anyway. It's just a quick business trip and a few days of relaxation before getting back into the grind." She reached out to hug him again, but he was already moving toward the small powder room. She frowned as he called back, "I'll wash up here, and we can eat when the kids come down." She sighed and walked into the kitchen to set the meal. Though she felt a lingering unease, she shrugged it off. Dinner was lively, with everyone talking at once about their adventures that afternoon at the park, their new school projects, and a science fair coming up. The boys were debating their project ideas. Will wanted to do the classic erupting volcano, while Robert had different plans. Their good-natured disagreement was amusing, and Rick let them discuss it until he finally intervened. Judith sat back and enjoyed the conversation. Eventually, it was time for her to get ready. Her bag was packed and by the door, and she only needed her briefcase and purse. She gave each boy a hug and a kiss before sending them off to play, leaving her and Rick alone. "I'm going to miss you and the boys. I wish you were all coming with me, but it's only 3 nights. I'll be back late Wednesday night. You'll be there to pick me up, right?" Judith asked. Rick smiled and nodded. "Don't worry, it's all arranged. You just go and have fun. I doubt you'll miss us at all." He gave her a big grin to show he was kidding, but Judith noticed the same shadow in his eyes. She had to get herself under control. This was crazy. Just as she was about to say something, the sound of a car horn interrupted her. "That's Rachel." "I'd better go," she said. "Take care of the boys for me, and I'll call you when I get in." Judith gave Rick a final, tight hug and a quick kiss before grabbing her bag and almost running out the door. Once at the car, she turned and waved to Rick, who had already closed the door behind him. She put her bag in the back seat and frowned once more at the closed door. She had a nagging feeling something was wrong but told herself it was just her imagination. Inside the car, Rachel asked, "Ready for your trip? I bet you're looking forward to this, 3 days at the Redstone. I wish I could have gone with you guys, but I just couldn't get away. Good thing Wes could go in my place. I wouldn't mind spending a couple of days with him too. Too bad you're so happily married, it could have been fun." Rachel's flippant comment drew a laugh from Judith, but she sat back, reflecting on why she was doing this. But she had already discussed this with herself, and it was too late to change her mind. At the airport, Judith checked her bags, went through the ordeal of screening, and finally found her gate. She had just settled in when Wes Southern sat down beside her. He greeted her with a broad grin. "Ready for this? Just you and me in San Diego. Too bad we have to attend the meetings. We could spend the whole time relaxing and enjoying ourselves," he said, almost laughing. Judith managed a smile despite her reservations. "We have been in some unusual places, haven't we?" "Well, we'll make up for that this week," she replied, leaning back and closing her eyes. She had planned this trip meticulously, and Rick had no idea she intended to keep it that way. Now it was time to enjoy the rewards of her hard work and planning. When they announced boarding, she was relieved to find it on time for a change. She and Wes were in first class, so they boarded first. As she settled in for the flight, she wondered again if she was making a mistake. She and Wes had started their relationship about 2 months ago during the intense design phase of their project. One night, after nearly 12 hours of work, they had both fallen asleep on the couch in her office. Judith woke up to the sensation of someone's hand on her thigh and initially mistook it for Rick. When she opened her eyes and realized it was Wes, the pleasure was too strong to ignore, and they ended up being intimate. Afterward, they talked openly about what had happened. Judith was overwhelmed with guilt, but Wes reassured her that it was purely physical and that Rick would never find out. They agreed to keep their encounters discreet, only meeting when the opportunity arose, without seeking each other out. Judith convinced herself that this was different from an affair and that keeping it separate from her life with Rick would minimize any harm. They continued to meet occasionally, always using protection as agreed, and managed to keep their secret. Judith's guilt subsided, and she began to reconnect with Rick, initiating intimacy at home again. Although their physical relationship was good, Judith felt that something was missing. She told herself that once she returned, she would refocus on her marriage and ensure that Rick came first. This trip was an opportunity to spend time with Wes outside of work, but she had refrained from meeting him in non-work settings to maintain a sense of control. Judith had accepted this trip knowing Rachel couldn't go, and Wes was the next in line. Despite her guilt and fear of being caught, she found the excitement too appealing to resist. Additionally, she and Rick had been more intimate lately and had started to explore new aspects of their relationship, which Judith found justifiable. In San Diego, Judith checked into her room, called home, and spoke to the boys for over an hour. When she asked to speak to Rick, the boys said he was upstairs and hung up without giving her a chance to ask them to find him. Confused by Rick's behavior and wondering if he might suspect something, she reassured herself it was just her guilty conscience. She shrugged off her concerns and went down to meet Wes in the lounge. They had a pleasant dinner on the company's tab and enjoyed a few drinks, but their excitement led them to head to her room as soon as they could. They almost shed their clothes in the hallway in their excitement before falling together into the room. The rest of the night was spent in passionate embraces, and they finally fell asleep just before dawn, feeling both exhausted and satisfied. Judith slept soundly until she woke up in that twilight state between sleep and wakefulness. She was overwhelmed by a deep feeling of loneliness and sadness, so intense it startled her awake. She found herself drenched in sweat, realizing Wes had gone to his own room. She took a shower to clear her mind. The next 3 days flew by, and their nights were filled with intense moments. Though the physical connection remained satisfying, the thrill seemed to diminish as their affair progressed. The excitement of the possibility of being discovered was gone, making their encounters feel almost routine. By the end of the trip, they mutually agreed that their brief affair should come to an end. There were no hard feelings, it ended amicably. Judith looked forward to returning home to her kids and Rick. However, she was troubled by the fact that she hadn't been able to contact Rick or the boys for the past 2 nights. The answering machine messages indicated they were out, and no one had returned her calls. She called Rick's office from the airport to confirm he would be there to pick her up, but there was no answer. She left a message and tried the home number again with the same result. She pushed these worries aside when it was time to board the plane. Once on board, she reclined her seat and fell into a deep sleep. The last thing she remembered was Wes's comment about trying to join the Mile High Club. She wished him good luck before drifting off. She slept through most of the flight and woke up just before landing at Kennedy. Feeling refreshed, she looked forward to reuniting with her family. Wes agreed to stay at the gate while Judith went to the baggage claim. As she scanned the crowd from the escalator, she didn't see Rick. She found the carousel and collected her suitcase, then proceeded to the exit. She showed her claim check to the waiting attendant, who verified it and waved her on. To her surprise, she saw a man holding a sign with her name, Judith Proctor. She approached him and asked, "I'm Judith Proctor. Where's my husband?" He looked at her with a disinterested expression. "I don't know, Mississippi. I was just instructed to meet you here. I was told you'd be on flight 1025 from San Diego. I'm to take you to 41556, Winding Drive. Is that you?" Judith confirmed and felt a surge of anxiety. Okay, let's go. I'm eager to get home. The man took her suitcase and led her to the shuttle van parking lot. They boarded a nice limousine, and Judith tried to call Rick again. The call went straight to voicemail. Growing more concerned, she tried his cell phone, but it was turned off. Feeling increasingly worried, she asked the driver to speed up. After what felt like an eternity, they reached her street. The house appeared dark and deserted. The driver stopped and handed her a thick manila envelope. I was told to give you this when we arrived. I don't know what's inside. The guy gave me an extra $100 to deliver it, he said. Judith took the envelope, recognizing Rick's handwriting, but couldn't open it yet. She was too anxious to get inside and see what was happening. As she waited for the driver to retrieve her bag from the trunk, she shifted nervously from foot to foot. She grabbed the envelope and rushed into the house, her stomach churning with anxiety. She was terrified about what had happened to her husband or one of the boys. Please, let it not be anything serious, she prayed. Inside, the house was as quiet as she had feared. The only lights on were the night light over the stove and the hall light, which they always left on for the boys in case they woke during the night. Judith checked downstairs and then ran upstairs, looking through each room. It was empty. When she entered their bedroom, everything seemed normal at first glance. But then she noticed that the door to Rick's closet was open, a door he always closed. She walked over and opened it further, only to find that his clothes were gone. Rick had taken everything. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, she moved slowly to the boys' room. The twin beds were made, their computers were missing, their favorite posters were gone from the walls, and the drawers in their dressers were empty. They were gone too. She ran downstairs to look for a note or letter, and then remembered the manila envelope. She found it lying on the table beside her purse. She turned on the overhead light and tore it open. Overwhelmed by the weight of what she saw, she sat down hard on a chair, her heart sinking. The envelope contained another envelope addressed to her, some photographs, a report from a company called Spaulding Investigations, and a document labeled Decree for Dissolution of Marriage. She screamed, her voice echoing her despair. The documents and photographs scattered across the kitchen floor as she threw them in frustration. She cried uncontrollably, her heart pounding and making it difficult to breathe. No, please God, no. Not this. Please give me another chance, she pleaded through her sobs. In her anguish, she began throwing dishes and glasses, desperate to express her grief. She continued until exhaustion overtook her, and she must have finally passed out. When she awoke, the early morning sun was streaming through the kitchen window, warming her face. She pushed herself up from the chair and shuffled through the debris to gather the contents of the envelope. The photographs were the first thing she saw. One showed her sitting on Wes's lap, with her skirt raised, another depicted them in a more intimate position on the couch. The last photo showed Wes's head in a position that made her stomach churn. She had to rush to the sink, sickened by the images. After washing her face and mouth, she returned to her chair. She pushed the remaining pictures aside, not wanting to see more. Then she turned to the report, scanning the first few pages. It detailed times, dates, and references to the photos, documenting her infidelity. She put it down, not having the energy to read more. The legal document was thick and formal-looking. Though she knew she should read the divorce terms, she was too exhausted and overwhelmed. The tears made it difficult to read, and she felt that there should be more to signify the end of their 15-year marriage. Finally, she remembered the envelope with a small kernel of hope. She tore it open and found a few pages written in Rick's handwriting. She wiped her eyes and began to read. Judith, by now you know that the boys and I are gone. I took only our clothes, some of their more important things, and my belongings from the den. I have a small 2-bedroom apartment for the 3 of us until we settle all our affairs. I should have said divide our assets. I've known about your affair with Wes Southern for some time. Want to know how I found out? I came to your office one evening after you called to say you had to work late. The boys thought you might enjoy a milkshake, so we stopped and got an extra one for you. The boys stayed in the car while I went up to your office. Pete, the guard, let me in when I showed him the milkshake. As I approached, I heard sounds that suggested you were with someone. I peeked through the door and saw you and Wes in a compromising position on the couch in your office. Thank God the boys had stayed in the car. I didn't enjoy watching, so I left, taking the milkshake with me. The boys and I went home and watched TV until you arrived. That was the night I told you I had a bad headache. You probably don't remember, but it was the first time you and Wes were together. She remembered it clearly and felt ironic guilt. She had been so consumed with guilt she wondered how she would face Wes, but when she walked in the door, he told her how sick he was, and she was relieved she didn't have to confront him. She had said a small prayer of thanks. She continued reading. I hired a private investigator, and you have his report now. He was a very nice man and was apologetic when he gave me the final report. We were both hoping this was a one-time mistake, but it wasn't. He installed a camera in your office when I copied your office key, the one you keep on your key ring. He said it made it easy for him. I have to admit, you really got into it with Wes. You looked very involved, but I couldn't look at many of the pictures. It was too painful. When you mentioned the trip and how excited you were, I agreed, knowing it would give me time to move our stuff out without you knowing. I didn't initially understand why you wanted to go so badly, but after making a few calls to your office, I learned that Wes was going with you. That was one of the lies you told me. You said it was just you and a couple of others, but it was actually just you and Wes. I bet you had a good time without worrying about getting caught. You seemed to do just fine with a couch, and in one picture, even with your office chair. I don't understand why you chose to betray us, Judith. You not only cheated on me but also affected the boys. Your actions have tainted the home we built together. I could have forgiven a mistake, but this was a planned betrayal. When I promised to love, honor, and cherish, I meant it. Apparently, you didn't. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow to work out visitation and custody. You love the boys, and I know you should be their primary caregiver, even though you are breaking their hearts now and will continue to do so as they grow older and understand what you did. I intend to let you keep the house so they won't have to move to a strange place. Seeing the pictures and what you did with him, my love for you has died. We have nothing more to discuss, so I won't be contacting you directly. I hope it was worth it to you, Judith. I'm sorry that what we shared wasn't enough for you. Rick. Now she understood the cold shivers and the anxiety she felt before. It was her conscience trying to warn her, and she should have listened. But it was too late. Rick was gone, and she had thrown it all away. Years passed, and both Judith and Rick moved on with their lives, finding success in their careers. Judith sat in her own company office, a business she built through hard work. She pushed papers around her desk, trying to make a decision. She told herself it shouldn't be difficult. After all, she owned the company and was considered one of the best in her field. She had received awards and a significant cash prize for increasing sales with her packaging ideas. But it wasn't going smoothly. Maybe she should bounce some ideas off Rick. He was always good at sparking her creativity. I picked the 3 best ideas I had been working with and began with the one that was my least favorite. Let's see what he thinks of these, I said. So, this one is just an idea to show the product floating on a raft in the middle of the ocean with dark clouds in the background. Underneath the raft, we have the words "Always be ready for the worst possibility. Call Continental today." What do you think? I agreed that this one was pretty weak. Maybe for something else, I said. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, then how about this? I continued. It shows a plane, a single-seater, maybe one of those double-wing jobs. The pilot sees the covering coming off and says, "Oh darn, why didn't I prepare for something like this? I should have called my Continental insurance agent before I took off." "Still nothing, huh?" he replied, struggling to come up with a good idea. Well, that's why I turned to him for advice, wasn't it? Okay, let's go for the final one, I said. This shows 2 people walking down the street, holding hands. In the background, a car is rushing towards them, but neither of them is aware of it. The guy says to the girl, "I got the papers from our Continental insurance agent today. We're covered for anything that could happen." In the background, the car swerves and hits a light pole instead of them. They remain unaware of the danger. "I like that one the best too," he agreed. "I think the client will like it." I'll get Clark started on it tomorrow. Tonight, I'm just too tired to do any more. I got up from the desk and turned off the light. As I turned, I saw my son was standing in the doorway, watching me. He smiled, somewhat sadly, and asked, "Talking to Dad again?" "Seems you do that when you're stuck." "Yeah, baby, it helps." "It always helps," I replied. And it did. I always felt better after talking with him. "What are you doing up?" "It's late, and you have school tomorrow." "You should be in bed," I said. "It's fine, Mom. I'm just getting a drink of water. I'll be there tomorrow for sure." "I don't intend to miss the final game," he said. "Neither will I. We'll be sitting right behind the bench like always. Robert and I will be the ones screaming the loudest," I laughed as he moved off to get his water. Tomorrow was the final basketball game of the season. Unless they won, the season would be over. But if they somehow won, which would be a miracle, they would advance to the state quarterfinals. I didn't think there was much of a chance, but Will was optimistic. As a starting guard, he had played in most of the games. At 17, he was tall and thin but strong. He was a senior hoping for a scholarship, and he was certainly good enough. He was his father's son in that regard. I walked slowly down to the kitchen to watch my son finish his glass of water and wave goodnight. After he left, I sat down, not yet sleepy enough to head upstairs. Besides being a great athlete, Will was also a very smart boy, not as smart as Robert but still no slouch. He had overheard me talking to Rick, my ex-husband, in my den. I did it quite often, and Will never said anything negative about it. Robert, however, hated it when I talked to Rick. It made him angry. I understood why. Rick and I had been divorced after 15 years of marriage, and today was the anniversary of the day the final papers were delivered to me, making it official. I had told both the boys what I did when they were teenagers. I told Will first, since he was the oldest, and then Robert 2 years later. Both took it hard, and I had some dark days afterward. But they came to forgive me, and life went on. They were a little more subdued around me for a time, but I gave them their space and continued to be there for them. They eventually remembered it was their father I had cheated on, not them. During that difficult period, Rick never used my depression or my actions as a reason to take the boys away. After he left, he reconsidered and gave me full custody during the divorce. He wanted unlimited visitation, and I agreed without reservation because having the boys was all I had left. I needed them more than they needed me. They had it hard during my depression, but I never neglected them. When things got too bad, Rick would take them, but I always came back for them. They supported me, probably with some coaching from Rick. Overall, it was a strange but fortunate time for me. The boys grew up learning to cope with serious problems at home and became strong, confident individuals. I was proud of them and who they had become. I never asked them what Rick said when they informed him of our situation. Rick and I rarely spoke except to deal with problems about the boys or to make plans for their futures. Both of us did quite well financially, so there was never any issue with alimony or child support. We worked that out between us without needing lawyers or judges. Once our divorce was final, we began to establish methods of mutual support, which became a habit over the years. We got along well, with no unreasonable demands from either side. It was comfortable between us now after several hard and bitter years. I don't believe he has forgiven me, but he no longer seemed to harbor resentment, which was a blessing for me. Why did I talk to him even though he wasn't there? Because I never stopped loving him or relying on him for support when I was troubled. The fact that he wasn't physically present wasn't much of a hindrance to me. I could see him as clearly as if he were there, hear his comments, and knew what he would say back to me. I could carry on a conversation with him without a hitch and always felt better after speaking with him. I turned to him whenever I was in trouble or had a problem I couldn't solve on my own. I never made a business decision until I had talked to him. Even my sons thought I was a bit eccentric, but it was enough to keep me sane and ward off the deep depression I faced. The first 2 years after our divorce were especially tough. Rick was so distant and unwilling to communicate or let me explain my actions. I didn't even fully understand myself, but I wanted to try to explain. Rick let his lawyer handle everything, and when I made it difficult, Rick threatened through his lawyer to alter the divorce terms and seek custody of the boys. I reluctantly agreed to his demands. I began to struggle almost immediately after the divorce was finalized, feeling myself drifting away with no way to stop it. I continued to work at my job, the only thing I had besides my boys now that Rick was gone. Even though Wes was still in the picture, we had no contact by mutual agreement. Unfortunately, Wes spoke to some of his friends about our past, which, rather than being a badge of honor for him, became my downfall. My reputation shifted from that of a dedicated professional to someone who was perceived as having used her personal life to advance in her career. Angry and alone with Rick gone, I buried myself in work, trying to disprove those rumors. I spoke to no one and kept to myself during the divorce process. After the divorce was final, one of my colleagues asked me out. I initially refused, but eventually agreed. We went out, and I drank too much, trying to get through a difficult evening. When we left the lounge, he drove me to his place. Our encounter was brief and unsatisfying. I told myself it would serve Rick right if I had some fun, but it was over quickly. He drove me home, and no words were exchanged. I wanted to prove to Rick that I didn't need him, but the experience left me feeling empty and uncertain about whether I wanted to repeat it. I declined several more invitations, but eventually decided to try again, hoping for a better experience. We went out to dinner and then to a lounge with dancing. The evening started well, but I drank too much again and began to lose my inhibitions. We danced several fast and slow dances. He suggested we leave, and I agreed. Unfortunately, our time together was again short-lived and unsatisfying. He drove me home without even getting out of the car. This pattern continued until one night I woke up on the living room floor, feeling disoriented and ashamed. My clothes were disheveled, and I couldn't remember the details of the evening. I had a vague sense that there might have been another person involved. Feeling devastated, I stumbled to the bathroom, overwhelmed with shock and regret. I spent the rest of that night and the following day in a state of distress, questioning why I was putting myself through this. As I sobered up and reflected, the initial feelings were ones of shame and disgust. What had I become? Who was I punishing, and what about my boys? Thankfully, they were with their father for the weekend. Once my stomach settled enough to let me move, I got up and cleaned myself up. I went into the office Rick had set up in the house and found an old phone book. I called a doctor and made an appointment as soon as possible. My next call was to resign from my position, aiming to put that part of my life behind me. I had to find a way to return to some semblance of normalcy and move on with my life. My 2 sons were the only things keeping me going at that time, but they were both in school 5 days a week, leaving me alone. I almost did something foolish a couple of times, but somehow, I didn't. That was a miracle in itself. Just before I lost my children and my sanity, I pulled myself together long enough to see a therapist. My doctor recommended Cheryl Hopkins, and she helped me by putting me on medication and staying close until I could grasp life again, first just by my fingertips, then clawing with both hands to find a stronger hold. Eventually, I pulled myself up completely, reclaiming my life with Cheryl's help. Through our sessions, I finally understood what led me to my actions. It was quite simple. I was a successful working woman with 2 wonderful boys and a husband I loved unconditionally. I had what many women desire, yet it wasn't enough. Even today, I can't explain why it wasn't enough. I was successful, beautiful, creative, and not unhappy or alone. I wasn't sexually frustrated, but something was missing, and I had no idea what it was. So, I began searching for it. Wes was a good-looking man, someone most women found attractive. I started noticing him while we worked on a project together. He flirted with me as he did with many women, and his natural charm caught my attention. Initially, I responded playfully, but then more seriously. We grew more aware of each other, and he eventually made a move. We grew closer during a particularly exhausting project, and I found myself drawn to him in ways I hadn't anticipated. His touch was both thrilling and unsettling, stirring emotions I wasn't prepared to face. I tried to distance myself, but a few days later, in a moment of weakness, I gave in to the attraction. From that point on, we met in secret, and our connection deepened. The excitement of something forbidden overpowered my guilt and filled a void I didn't fully understand. Our relationship continued for 3 months, culminating in a trip to San Diego where we spent several days together. But in the end, it wasn't enough to save my marriage. At work, I kept going, but without much direction. My position was secure, though it felt precarious given the circumstances. Wes held a higher role, and while I had some leverage, I didn't want to make waves as long as they let me be. I made poor choices afterward, going out with people who were aware of my situation and didn't have my best interests at heart. I allowed it, thinking I could rediscover something of myself, but it was a misguided attempt to escape the emptiness I felt. It was a mistake, and the encounters were nothing more than quick, meaningless interactions where I ended up lying and feeling empty. I was using them in a desperate attempt to escape the numbness that had taken over my life, but it was all in vain. The following morning, after that dreadful night when I couldn't even recall what had happened, I called my doctor. That marked the beginning of my slow, difficult climb out of depression. Cheryl was determined and wouldn't let me slip back down. She was unwavering in her support. It took nearly 2 years, but her treatment was effective. Even now, I continue to see her occasionally. During that period, I quit my job and distanced myself from those old connections. I had no desire to return to that environment. Once I had completed my recovery, which was appropriate for that time, I needed to find a new job. Rick had provided enough financial stability that I didn't have to work, and he continued to maintain the insurance for us. I had enough for the essentials, food, utilities, and the boys' needs. But for my own sanity, I needed a job. Returning to my old company was not an option. I was skilled in graphic design and packaging design, and I knew many people in that field. While my old company was one of the top in the industry, they often turned down smaller projects, which I was capable of handling on my own. So, I decided to give it a try. I obtained a business license and started my own small company, operating from home. I named it J. Proctor Packaging Concepts. I advertised online and through word of mouth to some of my former contacts. I also borrowed some money from the bank, using the house as collateral. Rick had given me the house in the divorce so the boys could grow up in the only home they had ever known. We had significant equity in it, so I used some of that for a small loan to buy the equipment I needed for my business, a computer with advanced graphic capabilities, a large color copier, a drafting board, and a photo layout setup. I also acquired a system for cross-comparing multiple media, allowing me to transfer the best images to film for printing and modification. At the time, Will had just turned 13 and Robert was 11. They were a great help, giving me time in the evenings to work while they watched television, played games, and kept themselves occupied. Since they were too young to go out alone, it was an ideal situation. We compromised. I made sure they got to their games and practices, and they left me alone later in the evening to work. Both boys understood what I was trying to achieve, and we functioned as a team. It was one of the best times of my life, and it was rewarding to see the business begin to grow. Initially, I only received a few referrals from former colleagues, but it was a start. After losing the first 2 accounts I pursued, I secured the third one and was officially in business. As the year progressed, my business took off. I had to hire a receptionist to handle phone and internet inquiries, a draftsman for the large board work, a color artist for filling in details, and a salesperson. Although I was capable of handling all tasks, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I set up a small office at the back of the house, which kept me close to home. This setup worked well, and I gradually took on more business over the next 2 years. My reputation grew, and my financial success allowed me to pay off my loan and all my bills. 2 years later, Will was 17, Robert was almost 16, and I had just turned 48. My business was thriving, and I had 12 employees. I decided to keep my company small, focusing on high-quality work for clients who wanted the best. My team was exceptional, and our solid reputation translated into profits. I was well off now, and my boys had everything they needed. I increasingly relied less on Rick, who agreed to deposit his support payments into a bank account for the boys' college fund. Will, aiming for a basketball scholarship, had already been accepted into Ohio State for the fall. Robert, with his academic prowess, was expected to secure a scholarship when the time came. Both boys were popular in school, with Will involved in a serious relationship and Robert starting to navigate romantic interests. As for me, my business success introduced me to many social circles. I was well known, invited to important parties, and had numerous friends across various walks of life. I was frequently featured in the social sections of newspapers. However, there was one thing missing: I didn't date. Since Rick left, I hadn't been on a date or had any romantic interest. Although men reached out to me, expressing interest at parties and social events, I wasn't interested in them. My friends encouraged me to consider dating one of the many wealthy single men I knew, but my focus remained on one man, who was no longer available. It might sound strange, but after Rick left me in such a dramatic fashion, while I was on a 3-day trip with Wes, my lover at the time, I was left reeling. We had spent the trip together, and I had told Rick it was a business trip, but I hadn't mentioned Wes. Rick was already aware of Wes and had everything documented. I was the typical cheating spouse, believing I was smarter than my partner and that nothing would come of it. I had no idea that consequences were not just for other people but for me as well. Ironically, that trip with Wes made me realize that I was done with cheating and lying. I found myself thinking about Rick constantly, and by the end of those 3 days, I had recommitted myself to my marriage. But Rick had other plans. He left me with pictures of what I had become, divorce papers, and a letter clearly stating that our marriage was over. His letter was blunt and to the point, and I deserved everything he said and did. I was guilty and had no defense. This led to a period of depression and a challenging journey to rebuild myself, which took 2 years. Of my life, the business I built for myself and my boys took another 5 years, bringing me to this point. Throughout that time, I considered myself a married woman and vowed to keep the promise I made to myself on that plane trip home from San Diego, to rededicate myself to Rick and my marriage. Even though Rick left and my marriage ended, I was determined to honor my promise, though it might have been too late. My pride wasn't ready to let go. During that period, I met many interesting men. I found myself daydreaming about a few and had several vivid dreams involving them. It was quite enjoyable, and I occasionally indulged in some self-care during the nights when my boys were staying over at friends' houses. Although I might have started with thoughts of these men, by the time I reached a moment of satisfaction, it was Rick who filled my mind. It's fascinating how life's circumstances can lead to such contradictions. One night, while cheering for Will at a game, he and his team achieved a significant upset, making it to the state quarterfinals. Will and Robert were ecstatic, and I was a proud mother, glowing with pride as we celebrated with Will's teammates at our house. The party was a success, with several parents volunteering as chaperones, and the night went off without a hitch. The following day, I learned about the upcoming schedule for the regionals, which would require some time off from work. I made the necessary arrangements, ensuring everything was in place. While I was working on the schedule in the kitchen, the phone rang. I answered without checking the caller ID. "Hello, this is Judith Proctor," I said, balancing the phone on my shoulder as I continued with my chart. "Hi Judith, it's me, Rick," came a voice that was smooth and familiar, one I heard in my mind often. "Yes, Rick, I recognize your voice. It's good to hear from you. It's been a few months, hasn't it? Last time was to arrange Will's birthday present. How have you been?" "Good, very good. I was wondering, Judith, do you have plans for the regionals? I know when it's being held but not the details. I won't see the boys next week and would like to make arrangements to see Will play." "I'm actually doing the same thing, Rick. The game is in Columbus next week on Saturday afternoon. Will travel with the team on the bus, but Robert and I are driving down Friday afternoon. We'll check in for the night, have dinner, and then check out before the game. We have tickets, and I even got one for you. One is good. Could we meet once we get there? You, me, and the boys? We could go to dinner and then attend the game the next day. I'd really like to sit with Robert during the game. Of course, you'd be there too, so it's your call." The idea of having dinner together as a family after so many years was unexpected. We hadn't done anything as a family since our divorce almost 8 years ago. I was surprised and a bit confused by the prospect of us all being together. After a moment of hesitation, I responded, "No plans here. Meeting for dinner sounds great, and I suppose we can sit together during the game. Will would like that, seeing his family together. Just call me when you get there. We're staying at the Madison Hotel, but that's not where the families are staying. They have a bunch of rooms set aside for parents at the Marriott Courtyard. You can call and make a reservation there if you want. You're listed under Will's family, of course. He knew that. How could he not know that? Actually, since I kept my married name, Rick and I were both listed as Rick's parents. I had already booked a room at a different hotel, so they shouldn't be confused when Rick called, but that was not my problem. My problem was why he wanted to have dinner together. That was new and different, and I began to wonder if he had some news to give us, news about him getting married again, or perhaps he was just engaged to someone he liked. He mentioned that he preferred staying at the hotel and would probably get a room there. I found myself saying goodbye to him and hoped I had not missed anything important. The last few minutes had passed in a state of shock. I took control of my emotions and set them aside while I finished the scheduling I was working on when he called. That was important and now had even greater significance to me. I was going to have dinner with my husband again, well, my ex-husband, but that was a distinction that wasn't important to me. I didn't mention my phone call to Will or Robert until just before we left. Will had spoken with his dad several times and all he knew was that Rick told him he would be there and hoped to spend some time with both boys. I was surprised he didn't mention our dinner together. It was just a dinner, nothing major. I was checking with the boys the evening before we were to drive down to be sure they had everything they needed. That's what I did. They were too old to make a fuss about it and just grimaced as I checked their bags. I told them to come down to the kitchen with me since I had something to say to them. As they took their customary seats at the table, I placed a piece of apple pie in front of them with a glass of milk. Both boys love my apple pie, and I had made this one just that afternoon. I had taken off work early to do that chore and to get myself ready for the drive down, not that I was worried about the drive. I was a nervous wreck, but not about the drive. Boys, I have something to tell you, I said. Will, Robert, the three of us are having dinner with your father. We are going to be together for dinner the night before the big game. Rick called and asked if we could have dinner together, and I said yes. I waited for their comments and was surprised when neither boy said anything. They continued to eat their pie without comment. I was taken aback by their attitude, but after a few seconds, it occurred to me that they just took it for granted that we would be together for something this big. How they could simply accept it was a shock to me. To me, this was a huge thing. I hadn't been together with Rick for so many years that I saw it as a major event in my life. Apparently, it wasn't as big of a deal for them. Well, I guess it is a big deal for me. I haven't had dinner with Rick for almost 8 years now. He wants us to get together, and I am excited. I'm sorry for making a big deal out of it. No, Mom, it is a big deal, and we know it. Dad asked us if it was okay with us if he came to dinner with you and us. We said yes. Will was smiling at me as he gave me this bit of information. He seemed to think it was amusing. Well, why didn't you mention it to me before? I felt like such a fool. You never make a fool out of yourself, Mom. You are the coolest mom we know. The team thinks you're great as well. We told Dad that, and he agreed with us and said he was looking forward to being together again. He thought it would be great if we could all get along. I listened to them, and we had fun with the secret and how I had made it such a big thing. They were excited as well, and underneath the fun and teasing, I could sense a feeling of excitement in their voices. This was a big deal to them as well. I began to wonder what was coming, and as I wondered, the possibilities were many and not all of them pleasant. I cleaned up the kitchen afterward and spent the remainder of the evening thinking about what Rick was up to. I finished packing and took everything out to the car and loaded the truck. I was nervous now, more so since our teasing. I tried to be positive, but the one thing that kept coming back to me was that Rick had finally found someone he was serious about and wanted to tell us all at the same time. He would use the dinner as the opportunity to get us all in one place and then lay it on me. That seemed to me to be the most likely scenario. I knew that Rick dated and had at least 2 serious relationships. The first one was 4 years ago with a woman named Leslie Wells. She was beautiful and financially well off too. They dated for over a year, and I heard that they were engaged to be married. Rick mentioned her to me once when we were meeting to discuss college plans for Will. He didn't give me any details, but he did say things were moving along quite fast. I didn't dwell on it, as the whole conversation made me feel deeply troubled. I didn't let Rick see the pain I was in and left as soon as possible. Somehow, their relationship encountered difficulties, and they broke up. I was relieved for myself but felt sad for Rick. The second serious relationship happened a year and a half ago with a younger woman named Jean Chambers, who was at least 10 years younger than Rick. At first, I was amused, but my concern grew as he described it as serious and even used the word love. I ended the conversation quickly and left soon after. He never mentioned her again, but I assumed he continued seeing her. I never asked the boys and made it clear to them that their father's personal life was off limits as a topic with me. They understood and never brought up Jean Chambers. I suspected that this dinner was Rick's plan to introduce Jean and tell us that he was going to ask her to marry him. I knew he would inform me and the boys before making it official. That was Rick, polite and considerate, except for the time I made mistakes and he walked out on me. I understood that the lack of consideration during that time was deserved. I had made mistakes, and I paid for them. The following day was warm and bright, and we left on time for the drive to Columbus for the quarterfinals. Will was on the bus with his teammates while Robert and I drove in our car. It was a 4-hour drive, and I wanted to get there early to have time to shower, freshen up, and dress for our dinner. Although Rick had broken my heart, I wanted him to see what he had left behind 8 years ago. I had a new dress, new shoes, new black lace undergarments, and a beautiful necklace with a diamond pendant, paired with matching earrings and the perfume he had bought me for our anniversary. I planned to look as elegant and attractive as possible. The cosmetic surgery I had 2 years ago had minimized my wrinkles, and my regular gym workouts kept me fit. We arrived at the hotel and checked into our rooms. I let Robert have a separate room but explained that he would need to share it with his brother. He seemed pleased and took his carry-all to unpack and change. We planned to eat at 6:30, but Rick hadn't called yet, so our plans were flexible. We decided to walk over to the parking area to see if the bus had arrived. We should have beaten it by more than an hour, so we might see it arrive. Robert led the way while I looked around the lobby and the adjacent shops. Many of them were within walking distance, and there were several nearby restaurants. The bus arrived soon after, and we saw Will get off before he noticed us. Jill, his girlfriend, walked up to him and hugged him. He smiled at her, leaned down for a kiss, and said something to her. She nodded and rejoined her friends. Will then spotted us and jogged over to meet us. We took him back to the room to change. Robert took him up to their room, and I left them alone to browse the gift shop windows and people watch. I enjoyed wondering about the people around me and where they were going. I sat down and had been enjoying myself for several minutes when I saw Rick come in. It was both a shock and a thrill to see him again after several months. I didn't get up or acknowledge him. He checked in efficiently and then turned away to find the elevators. I watched him walk away, and memories of what we once had flooded back. I felt a warm sensation as I remembered our past together. Despite the time that had passed, my thoughts of Rick still evoked strong feelings. I let him go up and then followed, heading to my room to start getting ready and to wait for his call. I wanted to ensure I was prepared when he did. Later, after finishing my makeup and hair, I walked into the adjoining room where Will and Robert were talking about the game and Will's plans. Will was trying to stay calm, but his excitement was evident. I listened to them and felt immense pride in the young men I had raised. They were gentlemen, and I was so proud of both of them. They were already dressed for the evening in clean shirts and pressed jeans. Okay, so I had pressed their jeans. I went back into my room through the connecting door, almost ready. I wanted to put on my dress at the last moment to avoid any wrinkles. For me, I wanted to be as perfect as possible this evening. As I was putting on my necklace and earrings, the phone rang. I picked up on the second ring to hear Rick's voice asking if we were ready. I told him we'd be down in 5 minutes and hung up. I began to panic. Oh God, what had I gotten myself into? Rick and I were going to be at a table together for more than just a conference about our son's affairs. I wasn't sure if I could even do this. I was already a nervous wreck, and I hadn't even left the room. I called out to the boys through the door and told them we were heading to the lobby to meet their father. Will and Robert came into my room, looked at me, and the way I was dressed. I held my breath until they whistled and said, "Wow, Mom, you look great." Even though they were my sons, I needed to hear those words from anyone, even them. I fought back tears and simply smiled at them. Before he could move, I hugged Will tightly and kissed him on the forehead. He pretended to resist but whispered, "Go for it, Mom. Go for it." With those words, my fears fell away. I decided I would enjoy the evening with 3 good-looking men and let the consequences take care of themselves. I was going to have fun. I opened the door, waved my 2 companions out, and shut the door behind me. I put my arms through each of my sons, and together we walked down the hall to the elevator. After a short ride, we exited arm in arm and went in search of my ex. We found Rick waiting in the lobby, standing alone and holding a small box. As he saw us, he smiled and moved toward us. We met in the middle of the lobby, looking like a regular family, husband, wife, and 2 handsome boys. I felt strange for a moment until Rick started to talk. "Judith, you look amazing. You are absolutely beautiful." He was staring, and I was pleased to note that the effort seemed well worth it. I smiled back, a blush staining my cheeks. "Thank you, Rick. You look nice as well." That was all I could manage, but it was enough to break the ice. Rick looked me over, and the blush spread. I enjoyed the attention, even if the thrill was not something typically discussed in polite company. He turned to Robert and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hi, son. You look presentable for a change. I hardly recognized you without your Buckeye shirt." Then he turned to Will. Instead of a fatherly pat on the shoulder, Rick reached out to shake Will's hand firmly. They looked into each other's eyes for a brief second, sharing a thought between them. Rick then held out the small box. "Before we go to dinner, I want to give you something, Will. This was mine and was given to me by my father when I went off to college. He told me I should pass it on to my own son when the time was right. I think tonight, before the big game, is the right time." He handed the box to Will, who took it and held it as if afraid to open it. Robert stood beside him, his feet tapping in anticipation. "Come on, Will, open it." "What is it?" Will looked at his dad, then at me, and finally back at the box. He carefully opened it to reveal a gold pocket watch, its surface intricately engraved with vines and leaves, attached to a short chain with a fob at the end. As he lifted it out of the box, the gold shone brightly, and the chain dangled from his hand. He gazed at it, touched the top with his other hand, and gently pushed the cover open. Inside was a white face with golden numbers and black hands. The inside cover was mirror bright and smooth. I was moved by the sentiment attached, from father to son. I was glad for Will to receive such a gift from his father. Robert was touched almost as much and showed no resentment towards such a meaningful gift being given to his older brother. Once again, pride in my sons took my breath away. A tear began to form in the corner of my eye, and I quickly brushed it away. "Well, can we go in and sit down? My legs don't seem to want to support me right now." I smiled to lighten the seriousness of my voice, but Rick seemed to understand. He moved toward me, took my arm, and led us into the restaurant. He had already made a reservation for the 4 of us. As we were shown to our table, Rick motioned for me to slide in first and then moved to sit beside me. Will and Robert sat across from us, both looking pleased with something. I tried to maintain my composure with Rick sitting so close to me. My breathing was a little erratic, but I managed to bring it under control and joined in the conversation that had started without me. Dinner was a very happy affair. The boys were ravenous, devouring huge double cheeseburgers with a big side of fries, while I had a salad and a chicken salad sandwich. Rick had a steak with a baked potato and mixed vegetables. We all had dessert, pie with ice cream for the boys and Rick, and a small dish of sorbet for me. After all, the dress was pretty tight to begin with, and I did all right, if I do say so myself. I was sitting next to a man I had dreamed of many times over the past 8 years. Most of those dreams were quite vivid, making it hard to concentrate on the food. After dessert, the boys excused themselves to head back to the room. Will had a curfew, and the coach would call the room at 8 to check on him, but he wanted to see Jill until he had to check in. He wasn't going to miss that call. Robert would do whatever his brother asked him to do, so the 2 of them were fine. I watched them go with a smile. It occurred to me that I was alone with Rick for the first time in many years, and the idea didn't scare me as much as I thought it would. After all, what could I lose? I had lost Rick 8 years ago, and he was the only man I truly cared about. Rick called the waiter over and asked for coffee for himself. He looked at me, and I nodded to indicate that I would like a cup as well. I was enjoying his company and wanted it to continue. The coffee was perfect, something to do with my hands. Rick said nothing for a while, waiting for the coffee. I was content to sit in his company, just enjoying the companionship I had missed so much. I asked myself why we couldn't have parted at least as friends. I knew the answer. The pain I had caused him was too great to ignore and forgive. I understood that well. The coffee arrived. The waiter set the cups in front of us, poured the coffee, and, after making sure we were okay, walked away. We were truly alone. I didn't know what to say and wondered if I should start the conversation. After all, wasn't this the discussion I had wanted all those years ago but never got? Should I take it now? Should I say the things I wanted to say then? I steeled my courage and was ready to begin when Rick turned to me. "Judith, could I ask you something? Just a few questions that have been bothering me for some time, if that's okay?" I was relieved that he would start the conversation. He could ask questions. I would tell him anything he wanted to know. All I wanted was to lay myself open to him and let him ask or say anything that might allow him to forgive me. I prayed that it would happen. I prayed that he would give me the chance to tell him he was never to blame for what I did. "Of course, anything, Rick. Just ask me." "Okay, first, is it true that you talk to me as if I'm there with you?" That was what he wanted to ask. God, I had hoped and prayed for this chance, and he wanted to know if it was true that I had always talked to him as if he were there with me. Yes, it's true. I've always done that ever since I started the business. I valued your advice so much, and since you weren't there, I pretended you were. I knew you so well that I think I knew what you would say, so I just filled in for you. You can't know how much you've helped me. There was a time I was going to buy a big laser printer, but when I thought about what you would say, I could just hear you saying it was too big and would cost more to operate than it would return in value. I didn't buy it. I bought a smaller one, which has been perfect for my business. Good advice. Why didn't you call me or ask my advice for real? Wouldn't that have made more sense? Rick asked. Rick, you made it clear that you wanted nothing to do with me. We both know why, so why would I call you to ask for your advice? Rick looked at me for a moment, nodded in understanding, and then looked away. I was afraid I had made a mistake by being too direct, but he turned back and continued, "You never date." Why is that? I know things didn't work out for you right after the divorce, but you are still beautiful and successful. I know any number of men who would love to go out with you. Why haven't you dated? It was one of the questions I expected, and I was ready with an answer. I hoped it wasn't a mistake to be honest with him. What did I have to lose? I had made a mistake 8 years ago and paid a heavy price for it. I had no choice but to face that price, but one thing I learned from working with my therapist, Cheryl Hopkins, was that there was only one man for me, and that was you. I promised myself after working with Cheryl that I would be the perfect wife for you. I saw that Rick was going to object, so I quickly interrupted him. Before you say anything, you have to understand something. I made that promise on the plane ride home from San Diego. Wes and I had already decided to end our affair, and I was ready to recommit to my marriage and to you. I realize now that it was naive of me to assume I could just pick up where we left off as if nothing had happened, but nothing I did then was reasonable or fair or right. I messed up badly, and I know that now. I understand why I did it, but that doesn't justify it. It just allowed me to understand why and to make sure I would never do it again. Even though we are divorced, I promised, and I have to keep that promise. It's important to me, even if it's only to myself. So you see, to date would be to betray that promise. While I have seen some very appealing men who I would love to date, I can't. It would break my promise to myself. And here's a secret that the boys don't know. Sometimes I think of things I'd like to do with them, but when I do, guess who I end up dreaming about? Rick looked puzzled and didn't respond. I smiled at him, waited a few seconds, and told him, "You. Even in my dreams, I can't cheat on you. I might imagine other men to start, but you're the one I end up with every time." I watched his reaction and couldn't help but laugh. It was amusing how he had no idea how to respond, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt at ease with him. It was refreshing to say something serious, funny, and even preposterous without fighting or arguing. It was just fun, and I realized I was genuinely enjoying myself. You don't even have to say anything. I just wanted to tell you that it's true, regardless of whether you believe me or not. I know my credibility might not be at the top of your list, I said. Rick shook his head, not quite sure how to process what I'd said. I'm not sure I know what you're saying, but that's fine. Another question, if you don't mind. What are your plans for the future if you don't date and won't date another man? Do you plan on being single for the rest of your life? I can't believe that would be your choice. Is it? Yes, I answered simply. That was my choice, and I made it 6 years ago, right after I came out of that dark place I was in. I explained it to Cheryl, and she accepted it as a reasonable choice for me. I had my reasons, and she knew what they were, so she never tried to change my mind or talk me out of it. Rick looked at me, his eyes fixed on mine. I met his gaze, feeling confident in my choices and the life I had built for myself. If I couldn't have Rick because of what I had done to him, then I had paid the price and was free to choose my own path. I had chosen to be alone. Rick was still processing what I had said. I had been honest and provided him with the truth, so there wasn't much more for him to say. The silence stretched between us until I suggested we move to the lounge for a nightcap. Rick gave me a look I didn't recognize. I knew all his expressions, but this one was new, a reminder that people change over time. Rick slid out of the booth, extended his hand to help me up, and led me to the lounge. I followed, admiring him from behind. He really was a striking man. He stopped to pay the bill while I waited in the lobby, noticing some interested glances from other men. I was used to that kind of attention and ignored it, maintaining clear boundaries. No suggestive looks, no lowered eyes, no false signals. When Rick joined me, he took my arm gently and led me into the lounge. We were seated at a small table toward the back, and Rick chose to sit next to me rather than across from me. I was pleasantly surprised and showed it with a wide smile. He smiled back. Judith, I need to tell you something, Rick began. I've had a private detective check on you at different times over the last 3 years. I wanted to make sure that Will and Robert were not lying about how you lived. I never wanted to invade your privacy, but I was curious about your social life. My smile faded at his words. I felt a surge of anger. After what had happened between us and the way he had shut me out of his life, it seemed unfair for him to continue monitoring my behavior. I wanted to address it. Rick, after everything that happened, you had no right to investigate me. I never did anything like that to you. I kept my boys from discussing you or bringing any of your affairs into my home. I gave you your privacy. Why couldn't you do the same for me? Rick seemed to struggle with his response. I apologize. At first, I convinced myself it was to protect the boys, but I knew that wasn't entirely true. You were a great mother, and they told me so many times. I knew they adored you and that you provided everything they needed to become the wonderful young men they are. Later, I told myself it was out of curiosity, wanting to understand how you lived without the constraints of our marriage. It was a shock to see that you weren't dating and only socialized with women or clients and their families. It drove me crazy trying to understand it. That's one reason I asked to join you tonight and for the game tomorrow. I needed to see you again and see for myself that you are happy and content with your life. I believe you are. You may not believe it, but you're not the same person you were before. This is definitely an improvement. As Rick spoke, I listened and surprisingly believed what he was saying. The Rick I knew would never invade my privacy without a significant reason. Even now, you're looking out for me and my sons, of course. Well, I guess you had a reason, but I would have appreciated it a lot more if you had simply asked me. We talked from time to time. You could have just asked. Would you have answered me truthfully? Yes, Rick, I would. This is me, the person I became 5 years ago. I'm not the same woman who cheated on you and caused you so much pain. I know who I am now. I understand what I did and I've paid the price. What's the expression? Oh, right, I did the crime and I did the time. It was a tough period for me, nearly 3 years of turmoil. First the divorce, then the aftermath, then the depression. But I picked myself up and moved on. So yes, I would have told you anything you wanted to know. In fact, I would have welcomed the chance to explain what happened and why I did what I did. I've always wanted to tell you two things. You were never at fault for anything I did, and I am truly sorry for my actions. Rick listened intently. When I said the final words, I noticed his eyes widening and a hint of moisture suggesting he was on the verge of tears. Rick had always been a strong, proud man, and seeing him so affected was difficult. I decided to give him space and excused myself to the restroom. Once inside, I allowed myself to cry briefly to relieve some of the stress, then composed myself. I washed my face, reapplied my lipstick, and used eye drops to reduce redness. I was ready to return to the table. Rick greeted me with a warm smile and a look of pride as I returned. He stood as a gentleman would, waiting for me to sit before he spoke. Thank you for giving me time to compose myself. You always did know me better than I knew myself. I smiled at him, touched by his words. I still do, Rick. I still love you. I braced myself for any possible negative reaction, ready for anger, pain, or even disgust. What Rick said next surprised me. I believe you, Judith. I truly do believe that you love me now and that you loved me then. I never doubted your feelings. My decision to divorce you was not about believing you loved Wes more than me. It was about how deeply hurt I was by your betrayal. I tried to find a way forward, but when I learned about the trip to San Diego and the lies, it became clear that my love alone wasn't enough. I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to walk away. Even then, I never stopped loving you. I just couldn't forgive you or forget what had happened. As he spoke, my heart ached not just for myself but for him. I remembered the pain of being cast out, but I hadn't fully grasped the extent of his suffering until later, through introspection and therapy. I understood now that his pain was greater than any I had endured. Rick, please don't blame yourself. I understand why you couldn't forgive me, and I don't fault you for it. I know what I did, and I carry that shame. You've been fair to me over the years, cooperating with our sons and never holding my actions against me. I'm grateful for this chance to say what I needed to say. It's a gift I will cherish. Thank you. Rick looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, but it wasn't anger or resentment. I felt a sense of relief and hope that perhaps we could move forward as friends. To steer the conversation to safer ground, I asked, "Tell me about Jean Chambers." The last I heard, things were getting serious between you two. Is she about to become the next Mrs. Proctor? My stomach flipped at the mention of Jean, but I thought opening the conversation about her might make Rick comfortable enough to discuss a potential marriage proposal. Rick's expression shifted to surprise. Perhaps he hadn't planned to bring her up, or maybe it was still too soon. He shook his head and replied, "I haven't seen Jean in almost 2 years. I'm surprised you even remember her. You mentioned that you thought you might actually love her the last time we talked about her." "I thought marriage might be in the cards," I said. "You were quite taken with her. She was young and dynamic, and I thought you might be able to keep up with her. It didn't work out, though. I'm not seeing anyone now. I haven't been with anyone since." "Why?" I asked. "You're still as captivating as ever. You're successful, good-looking, and well-off. What's stopping you?" Rick sighed. "I can't seem to find anyone who fulfills me completely. Some women were too assertive, some were not assertive enough, some weren't good in bed, and others were just looking for someone to take care of them. None of them had everything I wanted. There was one woman who had it all, but it didn't work out." I leaned in, intrigued. "Was she someone special? Someone who let you go?" "Yes, she was you," Rick said quietly. "And yes, she did let me go. Actually, she pushed me away. It was a shame because she was perfect for me." My heart raced. This was my chance for something I had once given up hope for. If I didn't try now, I would regret it forever. I took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. Maybe she learned her lesson. Maybe she's wiser now and understands what she had with a man like you. Perhaps she's ready for a future together and won't repeat the same mistakes. Do you think that's possible? Could she be different this time? Rick's gaze was serious. Why would she make the same mistakes again? I don't think I could handle that. The first time was too painful. I believed she would do everything in her power to avoid causing that kind of pain again. I looked at Rick, holding my breath. Could he forgive me? Had the years softened his heart enough to allow for a renewed connection? I held his gaze, hoping he could see the truth of who I had become. Rick didn't say anything but reached for my hand. I placed it in his, my heart pounding. If he didn't speak soon, I felt I might lose control of my emotions. The night had taken an unexpected turn, offering a chance I believed was lost forever. I was on the edge, waiting for his response. I believe you because I want to believe you, Judith. I have to believe you if I want to be happy. I haven't been happy for the past 8 years. I've tried to forget you and move on, but it hasn't worked. None of the women I've met were you, and that's what I was searching for. I've come to realize that there's only one woman for me. But Judith, the only thing I can say today is that I forgive you. I forgive you for destroying my family and my marriage. All these years, I tried to move on but couldn't. I was held back by anger. Now, I let it go. I hold nothing against you now, no anger, no hate, and finally, no love. He walked away, leaving me with a profound sense of finality. Will's team was defeated in the quarterfinals, but we cheered him on despite the loss. He played brilliantly and earned the scholarship he wanted. His father and I were proud of him. He went on to play in college, graduated with a degree in business management, and eventually took over his father's company. Along the way, he married Jill, his high school sweetheart, and they have 3 wonderful children. Robert earned an academic scholarship to Harvard, where he pursued a career in law and graduated with honors. After completing his degree, he joined a practice in New York City and quickly earned a reputation as a determined and effective lawyer. Eventually, he started his own practice, which now includes 4 lawyers. He recently proposed to a woman he met through his work, and they appear to be deeply in love. We wish them all the best. Rick and I met several times after our separation. He was always kind to me, though it felt as though his niceness was more a matter of formality than genuine warmth. Despite the fact that I still cared for him, it was clear that our connection was no longer there. I couldn't blame him. I was the one who had changed our relationship. I continued running my company and allowed my partners to take on more responsibilities while I worked less. When Rick decided to pass on his company to Will, I made a similarly difficult decision and sold my company to a group of my employees. We reached an agreement, and I retired for good. I celebrated my 60th birthday with a gathering of friends and family. Although I put on a brave face and engaged with everyone, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. I had a home, a car, and my sons, but I lacked someone to share my life with. Rick passed away a year later. He never married, and his quiet departure came in his sleep. Seeing him in the casket, white-haired, clean-shaven, and still handsome, brought back memories of what we once had. Though he had left me years ago, his passing felt like another loss. I still visit his grave, but I struggle to find words. The regret of my choices remains, and I often find myself thinking, if only I hadn't made those decisions. The only solace I have is in the memories of what might have been. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.